Good morning.
Good morning.
Today is November 19, 2020. I am Dolores Boyd here with Judge Vanzetta, Penn, McPherson, and we are in the United States Courthouse where she graced the federal bench for 15 years as a United States Magistrate judge. It is my great pleasure to interview Judge McPherson as part of an oral history archive project started over 20 years ago, primarily to honor the judges and lawyers who have distinguished this United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. Full disclosure is in order. Judge McPherson is not a stranger to me. Over the years, we have nurtured relationships on multiple fronts. Her only child, now a medical doctor, has been my loving godson for more than 40 years. We have been close neighbors for that duration. We built, owned, and managed a bookstore for more than a decade. We were close colleagues as lawyers, and though we were in our separate practices at the time, we practiced almost as partners. And in this very United States courthouse, we were judges together. Through many other ventures, we remain inseparable best friends. So Judge McPherson helping to shine a public light on this incredible journey of yours is a special delight for me.
And for me.
I want to start this interview with a retrospective inquiry that's premised on one of your favorite quotes. What you are is God's gift to you. What you make of yourself is your gift to God. And so let's get this hard question out of the way first. You are now in the 7th decade of your life, 6 months roughly past the 73rd birthday of God's gift to you. As you look back now, how do you report succinctly what you did make of yourself? That is, what is your gift to God?
Thank you for asking that. I believe that I have taken some of the raw material, and indeed it was raw, that God gave me, and made of it, in summary, a life that has made a difference. Starting with the difference that I believe I have made in and for my family. And family in this context includes ancestors as well as descendants. I believe that I actualized some of my parents' and grandparents' dreams for me and hopes for me, that is, hopes for success, hopes for good health, hopes for a positive family life of my own, hopes for a life of contribution. I believe that I have actualized my own hopes for my descendants, namely providing for them a nurturing, moral home life, a wonderful education, good times, and love and compassion for each other and for their fellow human beings. And while I don't regard myself as a biblical scholar by any means, I believe that an essential part of my gift to God has been acceptance, acknowledgement, and compliance with what I have deemed to be His will.
Well, let's take a closer look now at the course of your journey and aim to find an evidentiary basis for your report of a life that's made a difference. I have chosen an analytical framework that should be familiar to you. It's one you outlined in a column you penned about aging a few years ago. Here's what you wrote. Every life blessed with seniority has 3 trimesters: growing up, growing out, and growing on. Gently spread across all 3 periods are questions, judgments, and goals. Let's start with your growing up years from 1947 to 1965. From your birth on May 26, 1947, through your high school graduation in 1965, the city of Montgomery, Alabama, was your growing up community. Let me remind you first of how you defined this phase of growing up. Here is what you said. It didn't seem so at the time, but growing up was the easiest part. Naivete was acceptable. Mistakes were expected and forgiven, and chances were multiple. When we were growing up, the world was our oyster. Time was eternal, and mortality was but a theory. The environment of growing up was saturated with endless questions, fewer judgments, and a sprinkling of amorphous and ever-changing goals. We asked judgmental questions, and we often articulated our goals as questions. With the luxury of time and imminent well-being, our growing up generation changed its mind capriciously on life's menu. Now, your growing up generation was the baby boomer generation. You were born about a year after the start of that generation. You graduated high school about a year after its end. Baby boomers came along in the aftermath of World War II, but they were still toddlers during the Korean War, and they came of age in time for the Vietnam War and all of those 60s revolutions which underscored America's divisions and tensions grounded in race, class, and gender. Describe for us the big picture environment in Montgomery during this initial phase of your life, with particular reference to the racial demographics, government, and societal norms.
Though the English novel A Tale of Two Cities referred to 2 cities beyond Alabama, that nomenclature is wholly applicable to Montgomery in my youth and to every other major southern city and many outside the South. Montgomery was 2 cities, one black, one white. The context of my growing up was the black city. It was a nurturing, close-knit, cohesive environment. It was a mutually supportive environment. It was a diversified environment, and by that I mean that people in my environment spanned the spectrum of occupations, of achievement, of undertakings, of lifestyles, and I appreciated that. It was also an extremely sheltered environment. I had the same experience as most other black children growing up in Montgomery. We were sheltered from the evil and restrictions unlawful though they were, of segregation. And we established for ourselves, mainly of course through our parents and other elders, a society that, though not multicolored, was nevertheless quite functional and quite productive. So my teachers, my ministers, the cab drivers, the store owners, everybody was black. And it meant that restrictions could be imposed upon you, expectations imposed upon you, goals set for you without regard for race, which of course is a major difference from my adulthood. And I think all in all, it was very, very positive.
Though you were sheltered in the black city, what was the reality of government in Montgomery, Alabama during your 1947 to 65 period?
Unquestionably, it was an oppressive hand. Characterized more by what one could not do than what one could do. One could not vote, for example, a major, major restriction. One could not ride in certain vehicles. And when I say one, I mean African Americans. In certain stores, you couldn't try on clothes, including shoes in certain stores. One store in particular, Al Levy's, downtown Montgomery, on Montgomery Street. You could not sit in certain spaces, not just in public and commercial spaces like restrooms, restrooms and restaurants and theaters, but even in doctors' offices and lawyers' offices. Everything was compartmentalized and divided into two, thus the two cities. So it was two cities overall, and everywhere you went, there were too many cities.
And the government for these two cities, was it as separate and unequal, or was there one government for black Montgomery and white Montgomery?
Well, depending upon how one interprets your question, yes, there was one government that governed the whole city, but that one government was remarkably insensitive to the black side of the city.
Because it was?
Because it was all white.
All white.
Yes, because it was all white. And it was all white, elected by all whites, supported by all whites. So it functioned in near total disregard.
As an example of that strict segregation, were you born in a public or a private facility or at home?
I was born in a private facility, the Oak Street General Hospital.
And was it a black-owned or controlled?
Black-owned and controlled. It was owned and controlled by 2 or 3 black doctors, the names of whom I'm sorry I can't remember, but it was actually operated by a nurse, a registered nurse named Addie Payne. Everyone knew that Nurse Payne was the one who really operated the Oak Street General Hospital. And that is where I was born. I couldn't have been born any other place except Fairview Hospital, St. Jude Hospital on Fairview Avenue, not Fairview Hospital. Those are the only 2 facilities in which I could have been born, though there were at least 2 other hospitals in Montgomery.
Notwithstanding the challenges of growing up in a strictly segregated environment, you've already remarked that your early years were relatively happy, filled with ambition, anticipation, stability. I think you described it as a nurturing community.
Yes.
So let's take a look at that confined community that nurtured you. Let's start with your family background. Tell us just about your parents, their names, where and when they were born, how they met and married.
Luther and Sadie Penn, my parents, were both Alabamians. He from Bullock County, Alabama, to the east of Montgomery. She from Lowndes County, or her family from Lowndes County to the immediate west of Alabama. Mother was born in Birmingham, but soon thereafter, my grandparents moved back to Montgomery. My grandfather worked in the steel industry in Birmingham, and he and his wife moved to Montgomery. So my mother was here from age 3.
Your mother is Sadie Gardner Penn?
Sadie Gardner Penn. She is one of the infamous gardeners of Lowndes County, Alabama, who hail specifically from Burkeville, but really they're all over Lowndes County. My father, on the other hand, was born in Bullock County, in Union Springs, Alabama. And Union Springs, like Lowndes County, in principle, is littered with Penns. Thus my holding on to my maiden name.
How did they meet?
They met as teachers. They both attended Alabama State University, but at different times. And so they did not meet until they both began teaching in Bullock County. Bullock County was my mother's first teaching job. My father was a teacher there, and that is where they met and fell in love.
Now, both your father and mother were born before the Depression?
Oh yes, mother was born on August 17th, 1918. Daddy was born May 29th, 1912.
And you were their only daughter, but not their only child. You had an older brother?
I had an older brother who was born in 1943, I in 1947, and a younger brother, an older brother, Ojeda Lamar Penn, and a younger brother, Wilbur Kenneth Penn, born in January 1954.
And both were part of your growing up years here
Absolutely.
in Montgomery. Let's take a look at your mother's side of the family. You said that she was a gardener, and you've referenced her family history down in Lowndes County. Let's start with the reality that's rather sad. There are many damaging injuries from our common slave experience, but from my perspective, one of the most damaging is our inability to really identify our ancestors, to pinpoint from whence we came, whether it was on the motherland or even after we made that trek to America, our slave ancestors. You're one of the fortunate few in that, at least on your mother's side, you are able to identify one of your slave ancestors. I believe that was your great-great-grandmother?
Yes.
Tell us about her.
I did not know her. I knew my great-grandmother very well. Mary Sanders was my great-grandmother, born in December 1874. So she was born approximately 9 years after slavery ended, notwithstanding Lincoln's famous proclamation.
But you learned from her.
I learned
the
from
name
her
of your great-great-grandmother?
Yes. Her mother's name was Peggy Williams. Peggy Williams, I don't know what her birth date is. My great-grandmother is buried in Shiloh Cemetery in Lowndes County, and we were always told that her mother's gravesite is near it. I must confess with much regret that I have not gone to Shiloh to look for it. But my great-great-grandmother was born during slavery. But I also happen to know that my great-grandmother on my mother's side, her paternal great-great-grandmother was also a slave. My mother was born into the Gardner family. Her father was Monroe James Gardner, my grandfather, born January 4th, 1892. His mother, whose name was Sylvia, was born into slavery. My grandfather told us stories about his grandmother, who was very light-skinned, the product of an illicit white-black relationship, covering herself with soot from the fireplace in order to appear blacker so that she could escape. He never had all of the details. It was clearly lore that was passed down from his family. But I have not gone on Ancestry.com. I was just telling my grandchildren that while I started and enrolled in a genealogy class in April, I had to stop because it was discontinued because of the pandemic. So I have been unable to trace that.
But you do know from your grandfather, Monroe, about his mother, Sylvia.
His grandmother.
His grandmother.
Yes.
Who was actually a slave.
Yes.
Now, you had a nickname for your grandfather, Monroe. What was that?
It was Granny.
Granny. How
and
did
it
that come
puzzled
about?
everybody because Granny is usually a tag for a female. But I don't know how it came about. I just called him Granny. He was Granny to me.
You had a nickname as well for the great-grandmother you were fortunate to know. You identified her as Mary Williams Sanders. I think you said she was born in 1874?
Yes, December 27th, 1874.
What was that nickname?
It was Sweet Mama, but that was inherited. I didn't invent that. My aunts, my mother, no, my grandmother called her Mama. So her descendants called her Sweet Mama, and I guess they did because of her disposition. I didn't find her disposition that sweet, but I did continue the name.
All right, so you have a great-grandmother, Sweet Mama, who was part of your childhood. We'll get back to that in a little bit. Your grandfather, Granny, and how about his wife? What was your maternal grandmother's name?
Her name was Louvenia Sanders Gardner. She was born July 18th, 1899, about 7 years after my grandfather.
Were any of your maternal ancestors able to secure a formal education? You've told us about your mom and your dad having been college educated. What about either of your maternal grandparents?
My grandfather dropped out of school after 4th grade. My grandfather was one of 20 children born to Monroe, his father, and Sylvia, his wife.
Another Sylvia?
Sylvia is a name that transcends generations in my family. There's a Sylvia in every generation since my great-grandparents. It's a very common name in my family. In any case,
That's one thing that went down from slavery.
That's right. That's exactly right. To get back to your question, he dropped out after 4th grade. My grandmother finished her freshman year at Tuskegee.
That's Louvenia
Sanders, yes.
Gardner.
She was my great-grandmother, Sweet Mama's only child. She went to college after high school in Tuskegee, but dropped out after the first year. We believe she dropped out because she and my grandfather got married and she had a child, or she got pregnant and they got married. We don't know the order.
Let's take a look at your paternal ancestors. Your father Luther's parents, who were they?
My father Luther's parents were Sidney Washington Penn and Ella Pickett Penn. I don't have their dates of birth in my head like I do my mother's family because we lived with my maternal grandparents. But I do know that my paternal grandfather was born in 1887. I don't know my paternal grandmother's birth date, but her name was Ella Pickett Penn, and they lived in Union Springs. They never moved out of Bullock County. I don't know how they met. My father was their eldest child of 4.
Were you able to identify any other ancestry, any other ethnic ancestry among your maternal or family, maternal or paternal grandparents. I know that for
Yes.
my father, there is some Indian ancestry. Were you able
Yes.
ever to identify any?
Yes. Sweet Mama, the maternal great-grandmother of whom I have spoken, had Cherokee blood. And I don't know the origin of that Cherokee blood. I can tell you that on sight, the Cherokee blood was obvious in her. Her visage bespoke Indian or Native American blood. My grandfather's grandfather was white. That is to say, my grandfather's father was Monroe, for whom he was named.
Granny.
Yes, Granny's father was Monroe. That Monroe's father was white.
Okay.
And my grandfather's family, all of his siblings and the Gardner side of that family is pale-skinned, straight hair, and other Caucasian features.
Something that certainly is not alien to most of African Americans today.
No.
That is having ancestors who include whites and Indians.
Yes.
Let's take a look at your childhood homes. You actually were reared in 2 homes.
Yes.
You referred to your grandfather Monroe, Granny, and his wife, your grandmother Lavinia, and her mother, Sweet Mother. They had a home separate and apart from your mother and father's home?
Yes.
Tell us about
On
that.
the same street. My grandparents lived in a 9-room house. I had to count them. A 9-room house at 431 Chappelle Street. We grew up, my older brother and I grew up there until my younger brother was born, and I think he was there for about 6 years. My parents, by that time, worked in Shelby County, just south of Birmingham. My mother was supervisor of instruction, which in essence, in those days of segregation, was black superintendent. My father was a high school principal in Shelby County, principal of Prentice High School. And they did not want us to live in Shelby County. They wanted us to maintain our home life in Montgomery and maintain our school life in Montgomery. So they left us with my grandparents during the week. They came home every Friday evening and went back to Montevallo, which is where they lived specifically, every Sunday evening. So we lived with our grandparents, essentially.
What was the routine in your grandparents' home? Were you free to roam about and do what you wanted up and
absolutely.
down Chappelle Street?
Absolutely. One of the blessings of my grandchildren's lives is access to technology. One of the blessings of my childhood life is that I wasn't tethered to technology. So fun and play almost necessarily meant being outside the house.
As a matter of fact, was there any technology
No.
in Granny's home?
No. There was radio, and we didn't have a television until I was 8 years old. So being outside, it advanced socialization, taught you how to get along with people, play with people, judge people, allow yourself to be judged, and learn your neighborhood. I knew the names of everyone on my street. And so yes, that fun was outside. It was playing games, making up rolling tires. And when I mention rolling tires to my grandkids, they wonder, what in the world is rolling tires?
What did your grandfather, what did Granny do for a living?
Granny was a wood peddler. He had essentially three careers as an adult. He worked in the steel industry. He left Lowndes County and moved to Pittsburgh, which is where one of my aunts was born. And of course, Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the world, just about. And he worked there for a while. Then he moved to Birmingham, continuing in the steel industry. And when he moved to Montgomery with his family, by which time my mother had been born, he began working for the railroad. He was a switchman. And he worked as a switchman until he lost half of his little finger. And for whatever reason, he felt unable to continue that, or he wasn't allowed to continue it. I don't know which. And he began working as a wood peddler for himself.
You mentioned wood peddling, and I automatically think about living in the country where I was born, not realizing that within the city of Montgomery, wood peddling was also necessary.
Yes. Granny had very close colleagues, if you will, 4 or 5 men whom he knew very well who did the same thing. Stoves were heated with wood. People cooked in wood-burning stoves and heated their homes with small iron wood-burning stoves. So people bought wood, and Granny sold his wood. He had baskets such as the ones that you see for decorative purposes only in places like Fresh Market and other high-end stores. And Granny filled those baskets with wood. One basket was 25 cents, 4 baskets for $1, and that is the way he made his living. And quite frankly, it was quite a productive living. Yes, because he was providing something that people couldn't do without.
Did you or your brother have any role in helping him make that living?
Oh, absolutely. My brother Ojeda, my older brother, worked on the truck with him. Ojeda rose, poor thing, every morning at 4 a.m. to go out on to help Granny make his early deliveries, because people had to cook breakfast. And wood is something that's quite perishable, so people tended to buy it either every day or every other day. So he went out every morning, and I was the secretary. I took the orders. People would call 263-6577, the number of my childhood telephone, and I took the orders for Miss Brown or Miss Cook. She wants 2 baskets, and I'd deliver those to Granny, and he'd follow those delivery orders.
How young were you when you started assisting in that manner?
I couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old doing that.
But you have pleasant memories of that time?
I do, because of course there was one telephone in the house. It was not a portable. It was tethered to the wall. It sat on an upright suitcase in the hall, and I had a little chair next to it, and I would sit there and take orders. It made me feel very important.
How about your grandmother? Did your grandmother Lavinia, what did she do for a living?
She did not work outside the home. She was what we would call today a stay-at-home mom, which is fairly derogatory, but she was a housewife.
And Sweet Mama was in the household at the same time.
Yes.
Now you mentioned an aunt, and you say that the house was, Granny's house had 9 rooms. Who else stayed there? What other adults were there?
I had 2 aunts who stayed there, 2 adult aunts.
These were your mother's sisters?
These were my mother's sisters, my mother's younger sisters. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, had 5 children. Mm-hmm. The eldest of which was my Uncle William. They had a second son, Leo, who lived for 3 days and died in infancy. Then my mother, and then my 2 aunts. During the course of her pregnancy with each of my 2 aunts, my grandmother contracted toxemia, did not know it, did not have prenatal care, and probably didn't have access to prenatal care. And as a result of that toxemia, both my mother's sisters, my aunts, were born mentally challenged, and obviously remained that way for the rest of their lives. They lived fruitful, long lives, each dying in her 80s.
Their names?
Their names were Ceola Gardner, born October 17th, 1921, and Wilma Gardner, born October 16th, 1922.
So you grew up during the week in a household with 6 adults, your grandparents, your great-grandmother.
Yes.
2 aunts.
5 adults.
Yes. Then your brother Ojeda.
Yes.
Wilbur was not yet born.
No.
You've described...
Well, Wilbur was born when I was 7. So
when you were 7.
Yes.
Yes. What did your grandmother and great-grandmother teach you? What were you learning from them during this period?
My grandmother, Luvinia, was the essence of ladyhood. She taught me the imperative of being a lady. My great-grandmother...
What do you mean by that, the imperative of being a lady?
I think my grandmother understood that ladyhood was both an appropriate grace and a useful weapon. Can't say that about many things, but she used it in both those ways. She used it as an appropriate grace to get along with people, to exemplify those attributes for her children and the rest of her family. But she also used it as a weapon.
Can you think of an example that would help us understand that?
Absolutely. Her carriage was such. Her carriage discouraged disrespect. She taught me that before you open your mouth, you must present in a way that encourages respect. I have lots of examples of, not lots, but a few examples of my grandmother interacting with people who are black and people who are white. She demanded that children respect her and say, "Yes, ma'am," like a lot of other adult women of that period. But she also demanded that whites show her respect. She required, through just saying it, as she did one day when she encountered a man selling vegetables on our street in his wagon, a white man who got out of the wagon and not atypically said, "What are you having today, Auntie?" Auntie was a pejorative, oft used greeting by whites to black women, especially older black women. And she countered him by saying, "I want to look at some of your peas, but I'm not your auntie. My name is Gardner." She always gave her surname without a title. And it didn't matter to her if you said Gardner or Miss Gardner, as long as you said Gardner. She never even gave the first name. And in my young adulthood, I did that quite a bit.
So that's something you can trace to her.
Oh,
That
absolutely.
is her example.
Yes, indeed. She also taught me orderliness. I learned from my grandmother that order encourages productivity. You can work better in an orderly environment. My grandmother and grandfather had a very ornate dining room set. It was black furniture, but it was also antique. And my job was to keep the whole house clean. And so you had to oil the furniture. These days we polish furniture, but when I was a child, you oiled the furniture because that's what furniture polish was. And you swept. We didn't have a vacuum cleaner, but you took those rugs out back and you shook them. And that did as good of a job, not as clean of a job as vacuuming. So she taught me about having an orderly environment. She taught me that you should present yourself in an orderly. She taught me how to iron. Now, my mother later added to that significantly, but I learned how to iron with my grandmother.
Was there anything unique or distinct you learned from Sweet Mama, your great-grandmother?
From Sweet Mama, I learned chutzpah.
Ah.
Yes.
Tell us about that chutzpah. There are many who would say now that you must have overlearned that lesson.
No, Sweet Mama was 5'1", and Sweet Mama brooked no ignorance and no ill behavior. She was noticeably biased toward men. So my brother Ojeda got away with murder. I, on the other hand, was held to the strictest standards. She called me Gal.
Gal?
And I was the only one she called Gal, G-A-L. And she held me to really high standards of behavior, but she taught me chutzpah and she taught me independence. Sweet Mama would, in those days, little girls wore crinoline underskirts. Crinoline being the stiff fabric that causes your dress to flare.
That often had to be ironed?
Sometimes. Sweet Mama would tie money to my crinoline underskirt, and even though she knew that we had bus passes and had enough money to catch the bus coming home, she would always say, "Don't ever leave home without your fare back home. Don't ever depend on anybody to bring you back home. Don't depend on people. Carry your own weight. Carry your load. Do your part. Always be independent." And I think that Sweet Mama was that way largely because Sweet Mama's, my grandmother's father died very early, and Sweet Mama spent a good part of her life as a single mother. So she preached that to me a lot and took steps to make sure I was learning how to be independent.
Now, though your parents were in Shelby County during the week, they made sure that you got not only the exposure to Sweet Mama and Granny and your grandmother and their wisdom, but you were one of the lucky ones to get formal education started when you were rather young.
Yes.
And I recall hearing you say that you were merely 2 when you started nursery school. Is that right?
You still say that incredulously.
I do. So let's see if we can set the record straight. My understanding from your reports is that you started at the tender age of 2, formal education. You went continuously through your high school graduation in 1965 on the very same campus at Alabama State College. Now it's Alabama State University. So on the record now, let me have you confirm that you actually were only 2 years old when you started school.
I think probably the best way to explain it to you and others is to distinguish it from what we now call daycare. It's not unusual for people to put their children in daycare at earlier ages than 1. My grandson was placed in daycare at 6 months, but it was daycare. And now they call it preschool. When I was growing up, it was nursery kindergarten. Nursery was from 2 to about 4, and kindergarten was 4 until one was ready to go to 1st grade. The difference between my experience and what people now call daycare and preschool is, well, are, because there are several differences. So the differences are, number 1, the teacher, the person over my nursery kindergarten, had a degree in childhood education, as opposed to somebody like today hired with no formal education to work in a daycare. Another difference, it was on a college campus, and that teacher with her early childhood education had college seniors who were majoring in education on site as cadet teachers. So there were 2 or 3 of them on site all the time, but supervising us was part of their clinical. So yes, I went to school at 2 years old, but it was school.
And you had the same teacher you have referred to from nursery through kindergarten, with her support from college teachers. But it is that teacher, I believe, who made the greatest impression on you. So tell us about that first teacher of yours.
That first teacher was all of 4 feet 11, Willetta McGinty.
Even shorter than your
Yes,
sweet mama.
yes, yes. Proving once again that height does not control make. Willetta McGinty had an unerring ability to relate to children. Though she had an austere personality, that was what was so interesting. She was not fun in games. She didn't come in saying, okay, children, what are we doing today? No, that was not Willetta McGinty. She was my first exposure, by the way, to Seventh-day Adventists, because she was a devout believer in that faith. She just simply had a mandate and a control about her that you followed her. And it didn't help that she was almost your height. And I didn't think about that then, but as an adult, it has occurred to me that probably because Miss McGinty was almost our height, that we related to her and that she became someone whom we would follow. She was strict about learning. She was strict about social learning, table manners, bed making. We had cots, bed making, cleaning up after yourself. All the things that these people who write these books about everything I know I learned in kindergarten, Willetta McGinty was the essence of that. But she was also meticulous about academic learning, counting, reading, talking, speaking, standing up and defending yourself. She would punish us. When I was growing up, corporal punishment in school was not regarded as anathema, and it was expected by parents and very much accepted by parents. So Miss McGinty spanked. So if you were misbehaved, you went in the cloakroom and you were spanked, and the rest of us heard you crying.
Miss McGinty then was your teacher for the first 4 years of your formal instruction, from roughly age 2 in nursery through the end of kindergarten.
Through the end of kindergarten.
Now, it's appropriate for us to set the context here. You went to nursery and kindergarten and elementary school before the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes.
And you were not in a public nursery or kindergarten. This was a privately funded kindergarten, nursery on the campus of a historically black college. Am
Absolutely.
I correct? Now, for contextual purposes, in Montgomery, what options did the black community have insofar as public nursery or public kindergarten?
When I was a child, the overwhelming majority of African Americans lived on the west side, that is, west of Court Street. So I think that my understanding of what was available is comprehensive. To my knowledge, there were 2, possibly 3 options. One was the nursery kindergarten at Alabama State College, which was on the east side. Another was Holt Street Baptist Church. There was a formal kindergarten, nursery kindergarten at Holt Street Baptist Church, operated and managed by the pastor's wife, Mrs. A.W. Wilson, on the corner of Holt and Bullock Streets. Possibly there was another at a school called Brown's Private School. I do not know if Brown's Private began in first grade or began before first grade. It would not surprise me if it began before. But there were only 2 options for sure, and possibly a third. Otherwise, children simply didn't have pre-first grade formal education.
Where was this nursery and kindergarten located in relationship to your residence there on Chappelle Street on the west side of Montgomery?
Brown's Private wasn't...
No, your own.
My own. Oh, my own.
Your own.
It was exactly 3 miles away. We often said we were 3 miles from the campus of Alabama State University. My home was on Chappelle Street, And Chappelle Street now is a turn off of Hill Street off I-85. So my home was very near Maxwell Air Force Base, which is decidedly west side.
How did you get back and forth to nursery and kindergarten?
Every morning my grandfather took my brother and me to school. And later on, the three of us to school, every morning. And every afternoon, we rode home on the bus, the Washington Park bus.
The entirety of your growing up years in school here was spent on the campus of Alabama State College.
Yes.
Is that right?
The nursery kindergarten was located on the bottom floor of John William Beverly Hall. Beverly Hall still exists at ASU. It was the science building.
And your nursery and kindergarten years provided not only instruction in the academics, but also in some of the social graces you've mentioned, learning how to set a table and having access to a kitchen in the school. Was there also an opportunity for you during your kindergarten years to be exposed to any of the cultural arts?
Absolutely. We were on a college campus. So there was an art gallery there. There were bands. There was a symphonic band.
But even before you started first grade, did you get exposed personally to dance or music?
Oh, yes, yes. And when I said symphonic band and choir, the nursery kindergarten's field trips were essentially leaving the kindergarten space and going to college-produced arts events, like the art gallery and the symphonic band concert. The nursery kindergarten kids would often march across campus to various events being held on campus. But specifically, nursery kindergarten girls could take dance, and I was one of them. Gloria Smiley was a physical education faculty member at Alabama State, as was Oline Underwood. And they taught dance. Gloria Smiley taught ballet, and Oline Underwood taught tap in the John Hubert Lockhart Gym at Alabama State. The Lockhart Gym was adjacent to Beverly Hall, still is, adjacent to Beverly Hall. So we walked through Beverly Hall and into the gym to take dance lessons. And I was 3 when I began.
Did that include instruction in ballet?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And it included a recital at the end of the school year. Now, of course, we were 3, so.
And did you also take piano during that
Yes.
kindergarten period?
I began taking piano later, much later. I think I was about 5 when I started piano with Mary Goldsmith, who was a music faculty member at Alabama State College at the time.
Help us understand what it means to say the laboratory school. I've heard you refer to the fact that you went to the laboratory school. In the context of the college, what was a laboratory school?
Laboratory schools were located on HBCU campuses all across the South. There was one at Southern in Louisiana. There was one at Talladega here in Alabama. There was one at the AU Center in Atlanta and other places. It really is quite simple. It is a laboratory for teaching majors. When seniors who majored in education began taking education courses, the clinical was a teaching assignment at a school. Here in Montgomery, teaching education majors who were seniors at Alabama State College were spread out all over Montgomery. Some went to Carver. Of course, they were spread out only in black schools because of segregation. Some went to Carver High School, some went to Booker Washington High School, and some went to Lab High.
Carver and Booker T. Washington High School were the public schools designated for black schools.
Yes.
All right.
One on the east side, one on the west side. But several of them came to Lab High. The function of the school was to provide a laboratory for seniors who were majoring in education to do cadet teaching before they graduated. And so we were Laboratory High School.
Now, having been a product of Montgomery's public schools during that time, I recall the hoopla after Brown, and I recall much later on reading about the decision in Brown and recognizing that the critical indictment of the court was that separate schools were inherently unequal, that is, schools separated by race. I also recall later, as I got to know alumni of the laboratory school and alumni of the Catholic school for blacks, that most of you, that is, most of you who were products of the laboratory school, were rather unfazed by Brown, and in many cases believe, even now, that the education you got at the laboratory school was in many ways superior to the education being provided in the public schools designated for both whites and blacks. So make the case for me for the pride that you alumni of the laboratory school have in declaring that your education at the elementary, junior high, and high school, which was the laboratory school at Alabama State, was superior.
That's an easy one. First, one has to consider the physical context. Lab High, as we called it, which of course includes 1st through 12th grade, was located on a college campus. Its location on a college campus exposed us to so many tangibles and intangibles. The first thing, and I'm not going to name these in order or rank them, but the first thing I will identify is that it exposed us to expectations. So often we forget to note it, but in fact, one's expectations is an index of one's achievements. So growing up educationally on a college campus meant that college was a certainty in your life, not an option, a certainty. A certainty because that's all you were exposed to. That's what you did. You graduated from high school and you went to college. Another aspect of its being on a college campus was that it exposed you to what goes on in college, the level of learning, the level of teaching. And I'll get back to that in a moment. And let me give you a concrete example. I mentioned that we walked through Beverly Hall to go to the gym to take dance. Well, what does one do when one walks through Beverly Hall? If one is 4 or 5, you go upstairs to the first floor, you're walking down the hall, you glance to your right, Professor Bobby Young's biology class is taught in that classroom. You go in there, and in his classroom are jars. One jar in his classroom had a fetus in it. And there was nothing we loved doing as 4 or 5-year-olds than going in Bobby Young's classroom, looking at that jar and looking at that fetus. Where in a public school of any kind in 1952 or 3 is one going to see a fetus, a preserved fetus, in a jar?
Probably nowhere.
Nowhere, of course, nowhere. It has things like that have a tendency to broaden your mind. They have a tendency to establish and perpetuate expectations for what is really going on in this world. And that's a significant part of education. In several instances at Lab High, we were taught by teachers who were faculty on the college level, French, physics. The basketball was coached by some of the same people coaching the college basketball team. Band, in some instances, art. So that those college faculty members did not alter their expectations when they taught us. So we were required to perform at essentially a college level. So that's one of the reasons why we thought it was superior. Another reason we thought it was superior is because every teacher I had from first grade through 12th grade, except for one teacher in French, had a master's degree. And I'm talking about 1953 through 1965.
And you're talking about black teachers.
And I'm talking about black teachers. We had a library, a full-fledged library that was not extant in most black high schools and many white ones.
Did you have textbooks that you could take home?
Well, you took them home because you bought them. Our textbooks weren't provided by the Board of Education. We were given a list of books at the beginning of the year that were required for our classes. We went downtown to Anders Bookstore, located next door to Morrison's Cafeteria on Lee Street, stood in line, bought those books, and went back to school. So yes, we brought them home because they belonged to us.
Judge, you've been sharing your perspectives on the case that your academic growing up years at the laboratory school were in many ways superior to the education most of us got in public school in Montgomery. I was recalling that during your high school years, there were just 2 public high schools designated for black students, G.W. Carver High School, which still exists, and Booker T. Washington High School, which no longer exists in that form. I'm wondering if you remember much about the white high schools, public and private. I do remember sitting in Lanier, naturally, because I'm a product of that high school, and Robert E. Lee. I know that Jeff Davis was not a high school when you were at the laboratory school, and you probably have no basis for comparing the laboratory school to either of those high schools. But in your adult years, have you come to understand whether there were any private schools designated for whites which were located on college campuses here in Montgomery?
No.
And were there any private schools designated for whites which would challenge your theory that the laboratory school experience was a richer and a superior experience, even to that of white students going to the private schools?
I don't think so. And I can give you some reasons why I say that. The most glaring reason is that the most well-known white private schools in Montgomery were created as a result of Brown versus Board and in direct response thereto.
Including the Montgomery Academy.
Including the Montgomery Academy, including St. James, including a number of others. Hooper Academy, Macon East, all those schools. Those are segregation schools. They are now racially diverse to some extent, but there is no question that they were created in response to Brown versus Board to avoid white children going to school with black children. So until they happened, and I believe they began around 1955 or thereafter, No, I can say that. And let me give you a couple of concrete reasons why. Lab High was a private school, and it wasn't just private in the sense that it was not public, but there was tuition, and there were criteria applied to admission. You didn't just walk in the door, as you can and should do in a public school. But another salient aspect of my first grade through 12th grade education is this. There was only one section of each class. There were no, I'm in the 10th grade, but I'm not in her section. I'm in the 4th grade, but her teacher is Miss Boswell and mine is Miss Jones. None of that. There was one section, one grade. Everybody in the 1st grade had the same teacher. Everybody in the 7th grade had the same teacher. We went to school with the same people from the 1st grade through the 12th grade. There are 5 people in my life with whom I went to school from age 2 at Miss McGinty's through 12th grade. There is one person in my life with whom I went to school from Miss McGinty through college at Howard University. Three of my teachers in high school taught my mother when she went to Lab High. They taught my brothers. That kind of cohesiveness is an accelerant to order, to discipline, to learning, to education.
And in your case, was that type of structure an accelerant to your cultural pride? And if so, in what respect?
As I said before, when I was growing up, my environment included all blacks. I didn't know any white people growing up. I didn't really know any by name, I don't think, until M.J. Haney Construction Company built my parents' home down the street. I knew Mr. Haney and his son. I think his name was Tom. I didn't know any, but more importantly, I didn't feel like I needed to know any.
You didn't feel any sense of loss by not knowing them or interacting on a regular basis with whites?
No. Of course, I understood and experienced white and black restrooms, white and black water fountains, white and black facilities. But in my life, those occurrences were so exceptional, that is to say, no more than once a week, if I went downtown, that I didn't perceive them as a bother or a hindrance. My parents didn't work in the homes of white people. I heard no stories of white oppression. I experienced 2 or 3 occasions of it with my father being stopped by police officers, but in the main, my life was unaffected by the scourge of racism. Obviously, the penumbra of racism affected me, but I had no frequent instances of racism that caused me to devalue myself or others who were black.
And certainly that reinforced the learning environment as a productive one for you.
Yes. When I studied history, it was black history. Obviously, we took American history, but Negro History Week, as it was when I was a child, was significant. I learned the whole history of Alabama State University. I can name every president, starting with William Burns Patterson. So that history and that story of achievement was for me a black story. Percy Julian, one of the most well-known chemists in America, is a Lab High graduate. And so we took pride in that before I was 20. And organizations and associations held conventions on college campuses because they could not rent from hotels owned by whites. So the Alabama State Teachers Association met on Alabama State College's campus.
And the Alabama State Teachers Association was the collective of black teachers.
Absolutely, as
which
opposed
was
to
segregated from
the AEA.
All right.
Now, in 1969, they merged.
But that was well after you had completed
Well
your
after
high school years.
I left Montgomery, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You alluded to the high expectations that were instilled simply by being on the campus of a college and being exposed to college teachers and having the curriculum taught by teachers who were well educated. And you mentioned being exposed to foreign languages. One you omitted was Latin, and that's special to me because the black public schools were very shallow in their offerings of foreign languages, and I do not know of a single black public school during that period of your growing up years that offered anything except French. Have you learned whether there was a black public school offering Latin during that time?
No, I don't believe that there was. In fact, I know someone who graduated from Sessions, the laboratory school at Talladega College, which is an HBCU located in Talladega. She did not take Latin. I'm not aware of any black school in which the students were taught Latin or offered Latin. As a matter of fact, I've talked with several ASU faculty, and I have learned that for most of the first 3/4 of the 20th century, many of the students who applied for admission to ASU had taken only one foreign language and only 1 year. At Lab High, you could take French 1 and 2, Spanish 1 and 2, and Latin. And those courses, except for Latin, were taught by teachers who taught the same courses to college students.
I suppose you could make the case then that your education at the laboratory school here may have been superior even to that at other laboratory schools scattered at the historically black colleges within the state of Alabama.
It could well have been. I'm aware of only one other, and that's Sessions.
That's on the campus of Talladega?
At Talladega. Now, A&M.
There was not one at Alabama A&M?
Alabama A&M may have had one. I'm not aware. I know that there was not one south of Montgomery.
Was there any such school or similar school on the campus of Tuskegee?
No.
Okay.
No. And let me add let me give another example. Government, and it's just government, it wasn't American government, it was government, was taught in 12th grade at Lab High. The school year was divided into 2 semesters. The second semester of government at Lab High was devoted almost strictly to communism. We took communism. We bought the Little Red Book, and we studied Lenin and Stalin, because communism during my childhood was an overwhelming fear among Americans. We learned that, that the communists were going to take over any time. And as you well know, the scourge of McCarthy in Congress had everybody scared of communism. And if you were a communist, you may as well have been a leper.
Now, notwithstanding the reality of that fear on a national scale, I can't imagine that the governor of the state of Alabama at the time would have sanctioned the instruction in communism on the campus of Alabama State College Laboratory School. So what was the oversight, if any, from state government?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because in fact, when the South was lawfully segregated, the attitude of whites, especially whites in power, was they are over there, we are over here. We don't know what they're doing, but more poignantly, we don't care what they're doing. So if you don't know and you don't care, you can't provide a lot of oversight. So Lab High itself, its very existence was a secret. I have met countless white adults here in Montgomery who have assumed that I either went to Carver or BTW. And when I'm asked where you went to school and I say Lab High, they are in a cerebral vacuum. They have no idea what I'm talking about. They've never heard of it. They don't know about it. They didn't know it existed. So if you don't know it exists, you can have a semester of communism.
Now, as a matter of historical context, Lab High certainly preceded your growing up years. Your mother was a graduate of Lab High. What is its history? When did Lab High have its beginning?
Lab High has a colorful history. Alabama State was established in 1867. It was established in Marion, Alabama. When the legislature decided to move the school to Montgomery, it came as a high school because Alabama State Normal School, as the black schools were called. A&M was called a normal school. So Alabama State Normal School was in fact a high school. And in those days, you could teach with a high school diploma. You didn't have to have a college degree to teach. So it was a teacher school from the very beginning. It migrated physically to Montgomery, and it remained a normal school until Alabama State began to add the first and second years of what was then called college. That did not happen until 1928. So in 1928, ASU that we know today added 2 years above the high school. And the high school then, that became eventually Lab High. A few years later, they added the second 2 years to give themselves a 4-year college. So there are people, I suppose, if they're still alive, who graduated from Lab High when there was no college component at ASU. So that is its evolution.
And during the entirety of your years on that campus between 47 and 65, what was the average enrollment in the school proper, that is from grades 1 through 12?
No more than 400, 425. Each class was too big. Each class had about 25 or 30 students. And as I said, there was one class per grade. And the teachers already knew who you were because they talked. And they taught your brother and your mother or your uncle and so they already knew.
That type of continuity didn't lend to much disorder or disciplinary problem.
There was not a lot you could get away with because people knew people. And remember now, it was in a segregated, holistic environment. So you were likely to have gone to church with your teachers. Your mother was likely to have been in the same sorority with your teachers, or your father in the same fraternity, in the same Elks or other secret organization with your teachers. So the intermingling resulted in a lot of cohesiveness, and for purposes of being a child, resulted in a lot of oversight. It was overlapped.
You have referred to the exposure you got at an early age to dance instruction and piano. Did that continue through your high school? Any immersion in the cultural arts?
I couldn't prove it the way I play piano, but yes, it did.
And did you play did the laboratory school have a band?
The laboratory school had a band, the college had a band, but certain of us in high school played in the college band, as we did in the college symphonic band.
What was your instrument?
My instrument as a child, as a young child, was clarinet. And when I think 10th or 11th grade, I started playing oboe.
And you played in both the high school's band and you
the
were
college
selected
band.
for the high school band?
And the college band. The only thing the Lab High kids couldn't do is travel with the band when it went to other schools for football games.
Now, though you were located on a college campus, did your growing up years at the laboratory school expose you to learning experiences on other college campuses?
Oh, yes, yes. I can think of one. There was an annual trip, an annual forum that Tuskegee sponsored. And high school children black high school children from all over Alabama went to Tuskegee and spent this week. And I wish I could remember the name of it. But we stayed in Dorothy Hall, Tuskegee's famous visitors residence, which is now the Kellogg Center on Tuskegee's campus. And you met kids from all over the state. It was an academic forum of some kind. I wish I could remember the name of it, but yes, it did. Now, I also visited A&M and Talladega. I never went to Stillman, but that was because of my parents' associations. It wasn't.
Were there any summer camp experiences outside of the state of Alabama that exposed you to college campuses?
Absolutely. When I was in 7th grade, my teacher, Ollie Phillips, asked me to participate in an 8th grade science demonstration school at Virginia State College. The 8th grade science demonstration school was an annual event at Virginia State designed specifically for children just finishing science, 7th grade. So I went. It was the first time I was away from home because I'd never gone to a camp. So in the summer after my 7th grade year, I went to Virginia State College, 8 weeks on the campus of Virginia State College in Petersburg, Virginia.
How was that experience?
Eye-opening, delightful. I learned to play tennis at Virginia State. I learned to play chess at Virginia State. The kids were from all over the East. We didn't have any Western kids, but they were from all over the East Coast. And I stayed, of course, we stayed in the college dorm. Each of us had roommates, and we learned. And one of the things that I learned that was so useful that every child should learn before I got to college was that I wasn't nearly as smart as I thought I was.
And you learned that from being exposed to other black students.
Absolutely. There were kids who were just brilliant. I mean, they just were. They just were. Little Samuel Coppage from Richmond, Virginia was just the class genius.
Speaking of class geniuses and brilliance, it will not surprise anybody that you graduated as valedictorian of your 1965 class.
Yes.
And that you were selected for the National Honor Society. It may surprise some that at some point in your laboratory school experience, you even were awarded for your domestic skills with the Betty Crocker Award.
It would shock most.
Again, just a sample of your academic prowess. You've already talked about the values that were reinforced by your growing up years in school. And before I turn to the community and make sure I've integrated those values and judgments and experiences that informed you, I want to make sure I've not overlooked any experience during your growing up years on the campus of Alabama State College that actually informed your personality or set your expectations.
On the campus, I think we've covered just about everything. I've already described the physical environment and the social environment, which was very important. There were some off-campus aspects, which I'm sure you're going to
Well, this is a good time to deal with those off-campus aspects. You've already alluded to your rather cohesive, stable community on Chappelle Street. You've said that it afforded you the opportunity to know all your neighbors. I suspect there was a church at the center of your community growing up.
There was, Bethel Baptist Church.
All right. And did you have any exposure during your growing up years to that church or any other church that left you with some of the values and judgments that would inform your career?
Yes. My parents and grandparents were members of Bethel. Bethel was located approximately 6 blocks from my house, in essentially the same location it occupies now. They were members of that church. My grandfather was a deacon at that church. And I was very young when I attended Bethel. My parents later moved their membership to Day Street Baptist Church in 1955, and that's where I was baptized. And I'm sorry that this is going to disgust you, but it was July 8th of 1955. I was baptized at Day Street Baptist Church. And Day Street was a really grounding Sunday school, BTU, and Baptist convention environment, because we were wholly participatory in the formal religious experience. Edna Mosley was our Sunday school superintendent. Sunday school was regimented. You studied your Sunday school lesson on Saturday night. You went to the State Baptist Convention every year at Selma University, which is a Baptist school. You went to BTU on Sunday afternoon, hoping that by going to BTU, nobody would ask you to go to Sunday night service. So it was a comprehensive experience.
In many ways, then, would it be fair to say that the church during your growing up years was yet another forum for getting an education?
Oh, it was almost an extension of school. Again, the existence of segregation meant that this was your world. And I parted my fingers for reasons, because there were openings and you could go out if you wanted to, but people tended to stay in. And so 2 of the Sunday school teachers at Day Street were parents of my friends who went to Lab High with me. 3 or 4 others, no, 2 others were sorority sisters of my mother. And so the overlap, the social overlap, was perpetuated at Day Street. And most of the people, in fact, I can think of only 2 people who taught Sunday school at Day Street who were not themselves teachers, who were not employed as public school teachers. So Sunday school was as academic as it was theistic.
Were the expectations of the students in Sunday school as high as the expectations imposed at the laboratory school?
Yes. Your grammar was corrected. When you wrote, the Sunday school teacher actually read what you wrote and critiqued it. She may not have graded it, but she critiqued it. Diction was expected. When you sang in the youth choir, if you were sharp or flat, you were told you were sharp or flat. The note was pounded so that you'd understand which note you were expected to sing. So yes, there was an academic patina on the experience at Day Street. We learned the church covenant, which I can recite today. You had to learn it, you had to memorize the church covenant, which I must add is much longer than the Apostles' Creed.
We will overlook that slight to those of us who were reared in the Methodist tradition. But the bottom line of your description is that the church was but an extension of teaching.
Yes.
And I would also add your perspective, I believe, that the standards exacted there were not subordinate or inferior to the standards exacted by Miss McGinty and all of the other teachers who enriched your academic life. Is that correct?
I think, yes, that is correct. And as I said, I think if I had to pinpoint something that was missing at church, you weren't graded.
Okay. Were there any other institutions, Judge, in the community during your growing up years that were essentially extensions of learning?
Yes.
Tell us about those.
One of them, of course, the one-on-one piano lessons that I took occurred in an environment of learning. But institutionally, I have to single out the Cleveland Avenue YMCA.
And for the historical context, again, we're talking about institutions that were created in segregation, maintained only for blacks.
Yes.
The Cleveland Avenue YMCA is now, I believe, the Rosa Parks. Is it called Rosa Parks?
It's still called the Cleveland Avenue Y.
Oh, that's right. Located on
Rosa Parks, which was formerly Cleveland Avenue.
Well, tell us about your experiences there during your growing up
Well, I'll have to
years.
start at the beginning. The precursor of the Cleveland Avenue Y was the black YMCA located on Houston Street on the east side of Montgomery. Houston Street...
Not what is currently considered the east side of Montgomery. But that side that was closer to Alabama State's campus?
Absolutely.
All right, go on.
One of the fictions of present-day Montgomery is that Court Street divides Montgomery into halves. When one passes Court going east, Fairview becomes East Fairview. But in today's life, it is hardly East Fairview. The east side of Montgomery probably starts now with Eastern Boulevard, not Court Street. In any case, anything located east of Fairview Avenue when I was a child was denoted east side. So Houston Street was on the east side. It no longer exists, but Houston Street is roughly where Pelham Street now is, that is adjacent to Crampton Bowl and is a part of the Houston Hills subdivision. And that is where the YMCA was located.
The YMCA for blacks?
Yes, yes. It was a 3-story clapboard building, a large building. And that is where I began taking dance lessons after leaving Olene Underwood and Gloria Smiley in kindergarten. And those dance lessons were taught by Consuelo Criddington, who is now deceased. So I took dance at that YMCA for as many years as that Y existed. Later on, blacks raised money to build a new YMCA, and I'm sure that effort was overseen by the Metro Montgomery Y. And the new YMCA was located on the corner of Cleveland Avenue and Wade Streets. And it now stands. And of course, I must add that the building and construction of the new YMCA was substantially aided by a $20,000 contribution from the Montgomery Improvement Association when Dr. King was president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Never mind that it engendered an investigation of where he found the money, but anyway, the money was donated by the MIA. So when the Cleveland Avenue Y was built, its crown jewel was the swimming pool. So I learned to swim at the Cleveland Avenue Y in addition to taking dance lessons there on Saturdays from 9 to 12. And I think I got up to Barracuda. I never got up to Shark because I was unwilling to dive.
Something else happened at that Cleveland Avenue YMCA. Wasn't it a regular site for the black community's programs and recitals?
Unrelentingly.
And, I believe that I first became aware of you during one of those infamous oratorical contests or Sunday afternoon teas. What do you recall about the YMCA as a venue for black cultural education?
It was one of the 3 main cultural venues in Montgomery for such things. One was the Cleveland Avenue Y. The other was the Carver Community Center, located adjacent to Carver School.
On Fairview.
On Fairview. The other was the Community House on South Union Street. It still exists. So those were the sites for events held away from homes, birthday parties, teas, programs, lectures, all sorts of events. The Links organization here in Montgomery, a black women's service organization, started the Gifted Children's Program, which you participated in, and I did too, but I don't remember seeing you. And
you were older.
Oh, that's right, I was older. That's true. The Gifted Children's Program was there. The dance class was at the Cleveland Avenue Y. Every organization under the sun had teas there. The Elks, before they built their building on Cleveland Avenue, had its oratorical contest there. So there were so many. It was almost a cultural site as much as a YMCA. Which interestingly enough, was more compliant with the YMCA's original charter, mind, body, and soul.
Though the black community, as you have described it, was self-sufficient in so many ways with its institutions promoting culture and education, let's not overlook the negatives of your growing up years here in Montgomery. During the mid-50s, you've already referenced the Montgomery Improvement Association, and all will recall that it was the organization established to build the organizational resistance to segregated buses. And it continued to evolve as the civil rights organization at the helm of integrating public accommodations, parks, and schools. So in the mid-50s, and certainly before you graduated high school in '65, the civil rights movement, which originated here, the nation civil rights movement, was energized. I cannot help but believe that you had some experiences which brought home to you the evil side of segregation and the resistance to the civil rights movement. So let's explore that a little bit. You've referred to riding the buses home from school after your grandfather would take you to school.
Yes.
That's the early years. And I assume at some point you were taking the bus to and from school.
No, I never took the bus to school.
It was always afterwards.
Always after school.
Do you recall any experiences with the segregated seating of Montgomery's buses?
I can't unremember that.
Because that's not part of my experience, so I want you to share yours.
Remember that I said that when I was a child, the overwhelming majority of black people in Montgomery lived on the west side. ASU was deemed to have been on the east side. I caught the bus on ASU's campus on the corner of South Jackson and what is now University Avenue. It was then Tuttle Avenue. And therefore the bus was full. I cannot count, I could not possibly count then or now the number of times I have stood over empty seats reserved for whites, because it was the Washington Park bus. And you see, this is all part of the inanity of segregation. It was the Washington Park bus. Washington Park is located in the center of Montgomery's West Side community.
No whites lived in the Washington
anywhere
Park
in sight.
Neighborhood.
And certainly none who would be riding the bus. We boarded the bus. The bus route began, maybe 5 blocks from ASU. We used to walk to the beginning of the route so we could be sure to get a seat. But you boarded the bus on ASU's campus. The bus was full of African Americans going back to the west side where Washington Park is located. So it was not unusual for those seats reserved for whites to remain empty for the entire trip. So I cannot count the number of times I stood over those empty seats, unable by law to sit down.
You didn't try to challenge that norm, did you?
Oh, of course we did. Many times we sneaked around and sat, but not often, because all of the bus drivers, remember, were white.
Were white.
Yes.
Now, in addition to that experience riding the buses, were there episodes you witnessed either modeled by your mother or father or grandfather that brought home to you the rawness of Jim Crow segregation? You mentioned, for example, your grandmother Lavinia and her demanding respect from the white peddlers. Was there any experience associated with your grandfather, Monroe, Granny, that stands out to you now because it brought home to you our burden of racial segregation?
There is one involving my grandfather.
Granny.
Mm-hmm. But it has a duality in its outcome. I don't think I've ever told you this. Before Granny bought his first Chevy pickup truck, and for your information, I cannot remember the date.
But surely you remember the model of the truck.
Well, you know, there was only one model back then. Before he bought his first Chevy pickup truck, he operated his wood peddling business with a wagon, and he owned 2 horses. Granny was going down Mill Street one day. My brother was with him, this is how I know this. And a white man stopped him.
And for the record, Mill Street, which still exists, was smack dab in West Montgomery.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely.
go on.
It was a segregated community between Mobile Road and Hill Streets. There are only 2 blocks to Mill Street. 3, yeah. Anyway, he was going down the street in his wagon with a horse, pulling the wagon, and a white man stopped him and accosted him. I don't know the reason why. I don't remember the reason why, but accosted him and began shouting at him and cursing at him and telling him to turn his expletive-deleted wagon around. Granny took out, and calling him the N-word, needless to say, Granny took his whip and whipped the white man and turned his wagon around and came home. My grandmother was frightened out of her wits, needless to say, because in those days, that was fodder for lynching. We believe to this day that Granny went unpunished because they could not figure out which N-word it was who whipped the white man. So, as I said...
And the white man could not identify your grandfather?
No. Any more than he could have picked me out of a lineup with 5 other black girls. Because such was the cultural disregard of the day. In any case, that was one, but 2 others stick out, and those were occasions when my father was stopped by white police officers. The events of this past summer bring back memories of that. Each time that my father, he was stopped twice in Montgomery and once on the way either to or from Montevallo where he worked. And probably more when I was not with him. These are just times when I was in the car. But my father is in the car driving, my mother's in the passenger seat, my older brother and I are on the back seats. The policeman stops my father, he's on a motorcycle. He immediately comes to the driver's window, tells my father to let the window down, has a demeaning conversation with my father, throughout which he refers to my father innumerable times as boy. Every time I was present when my father encountered white men, unless it was white men with whom he worked in Montevallo, he was referred to as boy. I have heard white men refer to my grandfather as boy. White men who are were more than 20 years his junior refer to him as boy. That was demeaning. I understood it to be demeaning, and I received it as demeaning, and I understood that it was race-based. So I don't mean to suggest when I describe my childhood as productive that it was idyllic, because it was not. I don't think anybody's is, but the least idyllic part of mine was racial oppression.
You certainly weren't oblivious to racial oppression.
No. I mean, if you went in Montgomery Fair, which is the precursor to Gayfer's, which is the precursor to Dillard's, you drank from a water fountain that had big word colored on it, and it was almost an appendage to the really cool big water fountain that had white. In its physical presentation, it was oppressive. As I have thought about it growing up, it would have made a difference if both water fountains at least looked alike, but they didn't even look alike. The white water fountain was a big machine that flowed, and the black water fountain was this little thing attached to it, marked colored, or it was across the way and it was smaller. Have you ever seen these motorcycles with these little side seats on them? Some of the water fountains I encountered look like that.
Did you have the expectation, as I did when I first saw the white and colored water fountains, that the colored water fountain would spout colored water?
No, I never had that experience. I never thought that. That's interesting. That's an interesting point of view. Now, I will say that my brother and I regularly drank from the white water fountain.
I believe many of us were tempted to do that.
Yes.
and made a game of it during that time. Now, one experience I know that you and your mother shared during your growing up years was shopping downtown, something I did not do regularly. How did your mother negotiate the Jim Crow segregation in the department stores downtown?
I cannot say that it was the practice all over downtown or by every saleswoman. I can only tell you that, again, I cannot count the times when my mother was standing in line at a cashier's counter and she was disregarded in favor of white women standing behind her. These days, when you're at a counter, the salesperson will say, "Who's next?" When I was a child, that question was never asked because it might have an undesirable answer. It was assumed that a black person would wait until all whites were served and would wait patiently and without challenge. My mother always challenged. She always said, "I was here before she was," and would insist on being served. In addition to that, there was and remains to this day a penchant by whites, some whites, in those days most whites, to degrade you by calling you by your first name, and certainly never to refer to you as Mrs. anything. So whenever my mother gave her name, she gave her name as Mrs. L.L. Penn. L.L. were my father's initials. Or she just simply said Mrs. Penn, in an effort to force white sales associates and others to respect her. And my mother was frequently, and I was present during all of this, my mother was frequently asked, "What is your first name?" Now, my mother wasn't using a Visa or a MasterCard, so it wasn't necessary even for the sales associate to know her name, just to know that she had enough money to pay for the goods. But frequently she was asked what her first name was for the purpose of referring to her by her first name, and she never gave it. She always said, "I told you My name is Mrs. L.L. Penn.
I can't let you leave this description of childhood, growing up experiences that reinforced the evil of Jim Crow segregation without having you recall one that was particularly searing to you because you were a participant in it. So share, you've written about this, so I have a right to bring it up. So share with us, please, the episode involving your efforts to play secretary for your grandfather's peddling business.
As I've mentioned, he was a wood peddler, and in those days, some black wood peddlers were allowed to get unused and undesirable wood from Marshall Lumber Company, located on what is the street?
Bell Street or Day Street?
Day Street,
Yeah.
the lower end of Day Street going toward the entrance to Maxwell Air Force Base. And Marshall Lumber Company is still there. Granny and others would gather at Marshall Lumber Company every morning. They were not allowed to go on the formal premises. They were off to the side, and they'd build a fire and keep themselves warm during the winter. And the wood that was deemed undesirable for construction was just tossed aside with, I'm sure, a corporate intent to get rid of it at some point. Well, they were wood peddlers. All they wanted was some wood. So they were allowed to come and gather it and sell it. And so that's where Granny was all morning, most days. And in the afternoon, after he loaded his truck, in the afternoons he'd come home, he'd saw the wood with his wood saw in the back, and then he'd sell it. One day, I needed to get in touch with him. Something happened, someone called, and I needed to get in touch with him. I knew he was at Marshall Lumber Company. I didn't know anything about their being off to the side. I called, a woman answered the telephone. I said, "May I speak with Mr. Monroe Gardner?" I was 8 years old. I didn't have the sophistication to understand the difference between what was in essence somebody on the premises to get wood and an employee. And obviously my grandfather was not employed by Marshall Lumber Company. She said, "Mr. Monroe Gardner," with disdain. I repeated myself in innocence. And she said, "We don't have any Mr. Gardner working here." And she hung up in my face. I didn't know what to do because I needed to get to him. Within 10 minutes, Marshall Lumber Company being located, a 2-minute drive from my grandparents' house, my grandfather walked in the door and said, "What did you do?" And I told him what I did. And he told me, he knew the woman and she knew him. She knew all of the guys who would gather in the morning. Marshall Lumber Company is not Microsoft. And she went out to the yard. He told me she went out to the yard and said, "Monroe, pick up your damn things and get out of here and don't come back." And that's what he did, not knowing what had happened. But she told him, she obviously told him someone called, because he immediately said to me, "What did you do?" I told him exactly what I did. And he said, "It's because you said Mr. Monroe Gardner." And I was crushed. I have never been so crushed by a racial incident in my life. And quite frankly, that's a blessing, because that means I've not been shot or otherwise physically harmed. But I was crushed. My grandfather had to find another place to get wood. It was a complete disruption of his business, and therefore a disruption of our livelihood.
And you were an innocent little 8-year-old.
I was 8 years old.
Yeah.
I was 8 years old. It was, from a racial standpoint, in my life, it's the most unreasonable thing that has ever happened.
And
the use of the word Mr. in
Yeah.
front of a black man's name.
You never forgot that experience?
No, I never forgot it. I never forgot it in a tangible way. You recall that when we built Roots and Wings at 1345 Carter Hill Road, which is now ASU's National Center for African American History and Culture, We let bids, and I strictly, deliberately, and expressly forbade any bids from Marshall Lumber Company.
And no lumber or any other
And
supplies.
no supplies, no lumber, nothing could come from Marshall Lumber Company. I don't know the Marshall brothers, didn't know them at the time. Don't necessarily attribute to them specifically what she did, but clearly the environment they established and maintained permitted her to do so with immunity.
Fortunately, you use that experience to inform your own tolerance level for disrespect that was racially based. And we're going to get to that part as we continue your growing up experience. Your grandfather stayed with you throughout those growing up years. Unfortunately, you lost your dear sweet mama, your great-grandmother, while you were still was it kindergarten by then or elementary school?
Sweet mama died on December 27th of 1954. So
And-
I was a second grader.
And you also lost your grandmother, Lavinia, during your growing up years.
Yes, fourth grade.
So, Judge, here you are at 18, graduate of high school, getting ready to go to college. I'm wondering who that Vanzetta Penn was at that moment, and I am recalling an old proverb that we have seen together. It's a Moroccan proverb that says, "Instruction in youth is like engraving in stone." Is there any instruction that is attributable to your youth that we haven't talked about before we move on to your college years? Any instruction that informed your personality, your values or judgment at 18? Any that informed perhaps your career aspirations or your viewpoints about this nation or this world? Anything we haven't covered?
I don't have a particular instruction. What I had going to college and leaving Montgomery was a paradigm of values.
A paradigm of values?
Of values.
Are there
yes.
any that we haven't referenced?
No. We've talked about a yin for excellence. We've talked about propriety. We haven't talked quite as much about morality in my home, and that it was not uncommon during the period of time I grew up. Girls were frequently admonished not to get pregnant. Premarital pregnancy was a serious stigma when I was growing up.
And it was a stigma across our West Side Black community.
Absolutely.
Isn't that true?
And a stigma across racial lines. It was just something you didn't do. I mean, and you were warned about it whether anybody thought you were promiscuous or not. Sweet mama never failed to say, "Gal," as she called me, "keep your dress down." It was one of her things to say. And I knew what she meant. Everyone knew what she meant. And as I said, we haven't touched upon that, but infusing your behavior with a sense of morality was a value.
All right. Well, as we proceed to transition from your growing up period to when you get away from this city and start growing out, we'll see how those values of excellence, yin for excellence and order and discipline and your sense of morality stayed with you.
Thank you.